When it comes to main event matches at WrestleMania, I don't think there's a match more polarising than the 60-minute Iron Man match at WrestleMania XII. While normally there's a general consensus on Mania main event matches, people are really divided when it comes to Bret Hart versus Shawn Michaels in California. Some people, including Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels themselves, think the match is a wrestling clinic and a case study for hopeful wrestlers of the future. Others, however, felt the match lacked excitement with too many rest holds, no pinfalls or submissions during the initial 60 minutes, and also people don't like the predictability surrounding the match outcome. So today, for a little change of pace, let's look at the Bret Hart vs Shawn Michaels Iron Man match in detail. We're going to watch the match and take down some numbers to see if this match really did have little in the way of action and excitement, and we will also look at the history of the match and what others felt when the match was all done with. Now, to be clear, this video isn't put together to tarnish the WrestleMania XII main event, nor is it put together to pat HBK and the Hitman on the back. We're going to take the time to actually look at the match from a different, more timed point of view. You either like this match or you don't. This video won't change that. So Shawn Michaels was getting prepped up as the next big star in the WWF during the second half of 1995. I've talked about this time in HBK's career already in a past video, so if you want more detail, do check that out. Diesel had been the WWF champion for much of 1995, but by the end of the year, the WWF realised he maybe wasn't the best choice as champion going into 96. Bret Hart then took the championship from Diesel at the 1995 Survivor Series, an excellent match in itself that really is essential viewing. Shawn Michaels would win the Royal Rumble in 96 and Diesel moved into a feud with The Undertaker. Bret was used extensively in the Diesel vs Undertaker program of 1996, with title defences against both men at the Royal Rumble and In Your House 6 respectively. Bret of course kept his title during these matches. I've talked about this too, but the amount of shilling that Vince McMahon done on commentary during late 1995 and early 1996 for Shawn Michaels is nothing short of embarrassing. Vince would put Shawn over with aggression on the headset to the point where we all knew that the WWF were indeed going to go all the way with Michaels. Shawn didn't need this kind of blatant and awkward approval. The guy was super talented already, and he didn't need Vince McMahon reminding us in an almost fanboyish manner. Bret knew it too. He was well aware that Shawn was going to be the next champion, and he wasn't overly pleased about the idea. The thing is, when things didn't go the way they planned with WWF champions, the company always went back to Bret and put the title back on him. It happened when Lex Luger was a flop, and it also happened when the Diesel project didn't work out. While Bret knew that Michaels was a better performer than both these guys, he also felt like he was being used from late 1995 to early 1996 as a transitional champion. Whether you agree with Bret or not is up to you, but I think it's pretty clear that Bret was holding the strap just to drop it to Michaels, and this was the plan from when Bret won the title at the 1995 Survivor Series. So in storyline, it was Roddy Piper who booked HBK vs Bret in a 60-minute match. Piper was acting as the WWF president at the time, and he felt that a match of this magnitude needed a stipulation. In reality, it was Pat Patterson who suggested that the WrestleMania XII main event should be contested in an Iron Man match. 60-minute marathon matches were nothing new in wrestling, even the WWF had promoted them before, but the match had never made its way to a WWF pay-per-view, let alone a WrestleMania main event. There's a great risk here too. It's not like fans were all too endeared by the WWF during this time period, and putting a 60-minute match in the most important slot of the entire year ran the risk of turning fans off even more. But I credit the WWF for trying this. They were getting away from what a typical WrestleMania main event was and trying to put athleticism at the forefront. Pat Patterson stated that he knew HBK and Hart could pull it off. He wouldn't have trusted any other two wrestlers in the company to work the match to such a high standard. The planning of this match too by both Bret and Shawn was quite in depth. Rather than go out there and get tired after 20 minutes, they decided to split the match up into parts. Starting slow, the two would work tons of submissions, then around the middle of the match, the pace would be quickened up into what some would consider a regular wrestling match, and then at the end, try to grab the audience's full attention with a bunch of daring moves. Now, there's a problem with this method too though, and I'll give you a quote from Jim Cornette a bit later that explains it really well, but you have to remember that this was the WWF in 1996. This isn't the NWA in the mid-80s or even Japan in the mid-80s. WrestleMania XII was hosted in California, a big WWF audience here who may not have been prepared for this kind of match that Bret and Shawn had planned out. But again, more on that later. Keep this in mind though, the reviews and feedback from the WrestleMania XII main event may have been much different had the match occurred in a different arena in a different city. Right, so we have a little backstory. Let's get into the match and do a little counting. Now, the main gripe people have with this match really is that it was a little dull, too many rest holds and submission holds and not enough action. I've got an hour to spare, so I'm going to deep dive into this WrestleMania main event loaded with a stopwatch, a counter and some coffee. What I'll do here is count every rest hold and throwaway submission move. We will time how long the two men were in rest holds during the entire match, and we will also count high spots during the match. High spots can be subjective, so to be clear, the high spots that I'm counting are top rope moves, moves to the outside, moves on the outside, big bump moves and finishers. I'm going to be quite relaxed with this too. It's an hour-long match after all. Basically, bigger spots in the match that are supposed to make the audience cheer and make noise will all be counted. Again, this is subjective, but we'll see how we get on as time goes by. Also, to be clear, rest holds will be just that, moves that the wrestlers are clearly resting in. This means things like sharpshooters, figure fours and the like won't be counted as rest holds. Headlocks and leg scissors, things like that, they will be counted. So Shawn comes to the ring on a zip line while Bret takes the more traditional approach by walking. If this doesn't tell you who the WWF wanted to put the strap on, then I don't know what will. The referee, Earl Hebner, goes through the rules of the match, which I thought was a nice touch. The WWF didn't really do this kind of thing back then, and they infrequently do it nowadays, if at all. So let's analyse the match then. Around 2.5 minutes in and we have our first rest hold. If we fast forward the first 10 minutes, I counted a further 10 rest holds used for an approximate time of just over 4 minutes. So nearly half of the first 10 minutes were spent on the mat. The first high spot I counted was just before the 10-minute mark when Michaels performed a head scissors that took Bret over the top rope. Maybe not a high spot in normal circumstances, but after the amount of rest holds I've just watched, I'm feeling generous. By around the 15-minute mark, we have another 3 rest holds but 2 high spots, one of which was the super kick to the timekeeper, which I personally feel was one of the better spots in the whole match. So a quarter way through and we have had 3 bigger spots and around a third of the match has been resting. So far, yeah, you can see why these arguments come up regarding this match being slow, but we are only a quarter way through. If we jump forward then another 5 minutes at the 20-minute mark, things aren't looking better to be honest. We now have had 17 rest holds taking up nearly a third of the match. I have to point out too that sometimes the rest holds would be broke and then quickly applied again, so if you want to be a little more lenient, you could probably subtract 2 or 3 off the total rest hold number, but still it's shockingly high at this point either way. The high spots from earlier also happened in a fairly brisk time frame. They aren't spaced out well here, so the first 20 minutes of this Iron Man match has been kinda slow. Around the 30-minute mark we have had more submissions applied, but we also have a high spot, a referee bump when Bret comes off the top rope. This effectively led to nothing, but this is also a kind of turning point in the match. I don't know why this bump happened here. I don't know if it was kind of a bookmark that the competitors gave themselves, but the match does change from here. Over the next 10 minutes we only get 2 submissions applied, whereas the high spot counter goes up by a few. This segment of the match here is when things turn into a more typical wrestling match. The pace was picked up and we have more offense from both guys. The first high spot was a flying dive from Michaels onto Hart from the ring to the outside. The second was a flying crossbody inside the ring that got reversed by Hart into a pinning predicament. And we also had Hart throwing Michaels out of the ring with a back body drop in the corner. Skipping in another 5 minutes, you can see the rest holds were kept to a minimum once again while the actual wrestling took to the centre stage. By the time we get to the 50-minute mark, we have 24 rest holds used in total, with a time of around 14 minutes in rests and 9 high spots. This is still a remarkably high number of holds during a match, but still, let's see where we end up as we get closer to the finale. The last 10 minutes has 0 rest holds. It's pretty fast paced as the men squeeze in around another 3 high spots, from Michaels performing his signature elbow drop to Bret closing the match out with a sharpshooter. Had the whole match been like this final 10 minutes here and there wouldn't have been anything to discuss, it would have been considered one of the all-time greats with no dispute to be had. When we close the match at 60 minutes, we can see that around a quarter of the match time was spent in holds. 24 rest holds, give or take, were used during the entire match. We had 12 high spots, and again I was quite generous with this, so if you wanted to be strict, you could remove 2 or 3. The match of course went into overtime too, so if you want my final tally, it would be 62 minutes of action, 24 rest holds, 15 minutes and 30 seconds in rest holds, and 14 high spots, seeing as there were 2 super kicks at the end by Michaels. Shawn gets the win, by the way, in case you didn't know. So looking at these totals, yes, a ton of time in this match was spent with both men on the mat applying holds that would never lead to a submission, and more so, it was used to pace the match out. You have to consider a regular 8 or 10 minute match. You wouldn't see a quarter of a regular match being used up in rest holds, especially in today's WWE where the action has become much more fast paced. Now, that being said, people also exaggerate how much of this match is spent on the mat. I've watched this Iron Man match loads of times over the years, and I always felt that more of it was worked on the mat too, but when I timed the match, my findings were actually less than what I expected. I also think others feel the same way. People have said that half the match is spent in submission holds, but this just isn't the case. And also, wrestling in itself is subjective. Just because you don't enjoy watching holds doesn't mean someone else doesn't. There are also people who like to look at the science behind the match. Why are they pacing? Why do they pace? Where do they pace? How long do they need to slow down before speeding up? That kind of thing. In terms of laying out a match and pulling it off, there is a lot to learn too from watching HBK versus the Hitman at WrestleMania XII. Earlier I told you I had a quote from Jim Cornette that sums up the WrestleMania XII main event quite well. Jim was questioned about what would have been different in the WWF had Bret won the Iron Man match, and he was also asked his general thoughts on the match. Jim Cornette said, "Well, we would have had a lot less headaches that year because once Michaels got hold of the belt, it was impossible to get it off him because he would lose either his smile or get hurt or whatever." I liked that match, but I don't think it was the best match that they ever had because, for one thing, it was in Los Angeles. Those people have such a short attention span and they weren't going to watch the match for an hour. If it was held in the Carolinas or an old NWA territory where they were used to those style of matches, it would have torn the house down. But the people in LA were a WWF style crowd, and the WWF style crowds don't want to watch a match for an hour. They did a great job, but it wasn't my favourite match of theirs. My favourite was Montreal. That was the best match they had, though it might have ended a little abruptly. The Wrestling Observer did a long write-up regarding the Iron Man match, with Meltzer saying, "The WWF self-proclaimed greatest title match in history in Anaheim, California was an interesting 62 minutes. Live, despite post-show proclamations and testimonials, the crowd was largely dead for the majority of the match. Quite frankly, it was downright boring live unless one was sitting in the bottom rung of the building where the hardcore WWF fans, many of whom travelled from around the country, were. The rest of the crowd seemingly came for the special pageantry of WrestleMania, which was non-existent, or to see the return of the Ultimate Warrior, which was barely existent but blew the roof off the place. The fans from the upper deck started booing early, starting at the 6:45 mark of the match when they went back to the mat after a quick high spot. There was little heat during the first half of the match and long lines at the snack bar since people knew the match had a long way to go. Don't take any of this as a knock on either Hart or Michaels. After watching the same match on television and concentrating more on their performance as opposed to the crowd's reactions to the performance, it was an excellent match. I think both Dave Meltzer and Jim Cornette make great points here in regards to WrestleMania XII being hosted in LA, and Dave Meltzer was absolutely correct regarding the fan reaction. Casual WWF audiences were not ready to sit through this, whereas the die-hard fans were much more forgiving. But yeah, that's our look at the 60-minute Iron Man match completed. All in all, yes, I have to agree, there was too many holds being applied, but I still enjoy the match. We get to see two of the best here doing a great job in terms of planning and execution, and because it was the first 60-minute match at WrestleMania, I can also see why they paced themselves. What might be interesting though is to do this again with Triple H's 60-minute match with The Rock at Judgment Day 2000, with the counters and the timers, just to compare the two matches in terms of high spots and rest time. I'm sure it would tell a vastly different story. Maybe that's one to look at in the future.